So without further ado, Pat Marino, thank you for coming.
So because no one wants to listen to me for like 2 hours, some of my colleagues have joined me. So Jane Prindeville and Darren Donahue are here as well. Awkwardly standing off to the side. They're the ones actually repping the company in their gear. So I figured what we would do, we'll first introduce ourselves, talk about what our roles are at USAopoly and what we do, and maybe a little background on how we got there. And then we want to kind of hear from you why you're here, what you're interested in, what you're hoping to learn, so that we can focus what we talk about on some of the topics you're most interested in. And then at the end, we'll do a Q&A and let you all have a chance to kind of ask the questions you're dying to have answered. So to kind of kick it off, my name is Pat Marino, and I am a game designer at USAopoly, which means I do the mechanics of the games. So my role is really to, as we bring in license, because we do a lot of licensed games, as you may be aware of, we work with things like Harry Potter and Game of Thrones, different movies, TV, some comics, things like that, is to take sort of that storyline and to distill it into a playable game. So coming up with what do the cards do? Are there dice? What do the dice do? Is there a board? And if there's a board, how do you move around that board? Or what's the purpose of the board? Sort of all the rules of the game. At which point I'm going to pass it off to some of our visual design team who's going to do graphics and 3D and all that stuff to make my engine basically look like a car instead of just an engine. So we are very much a team development thing, but I'll also try to talk about what I did before, which was working as an independent game designer and pitching to publishers, where you kind of have to do a broader spectrum of the work in order to get a publisher to eventually sign and agree to publish your game. So I'll talk a bit about that process too for those who are interested. But
All right, well, I'm Jane Prindeville. I am just a graphic designer at USAopoly. I used to work in production for about 3 years. So I helped prep the games, get them ready to go to China, and made sure that things didn't get screwed up and that the end result was what we were expecting. And then now I've transitioned into a game designer where I work on the art. I've also worked a little bit on helping with the game design and the mechanics and things like that, because it is all hands on deck. So there's a lot of back and forth. Yeah, so I can answer questions about production and or designing based on licenses, trying to do signature games and things like that. And then this is...
I'm Darren Donahue. I'm the lead sculptor over at the Op. And I've been doing that for about 2.5 years. So I do all of the movers, chess pieces, pretty much everything in the Monopoly games, Clue games, all those 3D movers. I get to do sculpt for a living, so that's pretty fun.
We are both alumni of
Yep.
here.
Yay!
So kind of jump around. What brings all of you here today? Anyone? What? Yeah.
I was suggested to come. I'm actually a graduate of the Art Institute myself. I graduated last quarter. And thanks to Angie, she happily invited me to come over and say hi again. Hi. So I've talked to you guys before, and a lot of times I get a lot of information. I'm actually currently still in the process of looking for another job. To those that are looking into companies like USAopoly, what would be like the general information that you would give to students saying, this is what you should do, and this is how you should get your portfolio up to notch to get yourself in a position where they can work for you guys?
That's probably a great question for these two. So
Yeah.
from a mechanics perspective, it's quite a bit different
Yeah.
from an art than it is from an art perspective.
Are you a graphic designer?
Graphic, illustrator, and game designer. So I'm kind of like that generalist.
I would say from like an illustrator and graphic designer, definitely have a style and be clean.
Okay.
Like you can have things that are very different in your portfolio, but I would have them like, you want them to look like yours, and you want to still look like you can work with outside things. So a lot of what we do, or like I do, is we work with different licenses. So say Game of Thrones, we have to adjust ourselves to what HBO wants us to use. Like we don't just get to go design what we think the Game of Thrones game would be. But you still want to have your style. So as an illustrator, I'd say focus on your style and go all for it. Graphic design, I'd say like have a variety, but like
so,
show
like,
that you
have
can.
your general portfolio where like, hey, this is all the stuff that I've done for myself, and then these are like remasters of like known characters or
Yeah.
art styles out there that I can replicate off of.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let's see here. I found, well, for me personally, the diversity of being able to do something really gory or like Walking Dead, and then jump onto something like My Little Pony.
Or
So,
girls.
it's
Those are the same.
it's good.
There.
To,
I don't know what you're
so
talking about there.
similar.
It's very similar.
Yeah. So, or going from Steven Universe and Yu-Gi-Oh to Attack on Titan, and just going from all over the place. I mean, I do a little bit of different universes all over the place, and I have to emulate multiple styles at different times. So it's
Flexibility.
it's important to show that you're flexible, but definitely, definitely having your own specific, recognizable style will definitely help you get
It'll
your
stand
foot in
out.
the door and really stand out.
Mhm. Thank you.
About how many pieces in a portfolio would you recommend sort of like having well polished?
I probably
guys-
had 12, maybe, I don't know.
Like 10 plus at least.
Yeah. I mean, because I came straight from here, and then my portfolio was all student work.
Mm-hmm.
And I had some that was like personal, like I'd worked for a social media agency, so I included like 2 ads I made, but they were not exciting.
Yeah.
So I did that to show that I could
do
do
it.
corporate-y, like boring things, but then I tried to put more of the fun.
Yeah.
So I'd say I probably had 12.
Okay.
I had more online, so I had my physical portfolio. That was a full sheet that I had folded up,
Mm-hmm.
that I'd hand to people, and they'd have to unfold it and look at it. And then online, I said, see more online. So I picked
Right.
out my favorite things for the portfolio, and then after, then I did
Okay.
put more online.
Now, what's your website?
Well, it's not working right now, but you can find me on Behance.
On Behance?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can look it up if you want my name. I can give it to you after.
Yes.
I just deactivated it because I've been working for this company long enough that I didn't feel like paying for it. Because you have to pay it every year to keep it up.
ArtStation?
I'm not looking for another job, so.
Just somewhere to post it?
Yeah, I could do that.
I just got introduced to ArtStation. Yep.
Is that new? Is that, how old is that? I feel old.
It's
Becoming increasingly popular.
It's
Yeah.
becoming popular because of the fact that it's like that more professional version of DeviantArt.
Okay.
Right.
So I think it came out 5 years ago, so it's still kind of brand new.
Yeah, I will say a lot of our competitors in the hobby industry are much smaller than us. So kind of for perspective, we have what, 50?
Exactly, almost 51
Yeah,
employees.
which in sort of our space, unless you're looking at like Hasbro, we're small compared to them, but compared to some of our competitors like Renegade Game Studios, who's also here in San Diego,
Yeah.
they have 5 employees. And a lot of their work, like their game design and art design, is all done through freelance. They don't have any in-house people who do that. And a lot of those company heads from the smaller companies are going on DeviantArt and scanning through for styles.
Yeah.
And when they find somebody they like, they reach out and say, would you ever be interested in, and can you do this scope of work?
Yeah.
Which sometimes means, can you generate 100 pieces of art for this deck of cards in a short time frame?
Right.
You know? Yeah, and when they find people who can deliver on that, they keep those people very close.
Yeah.
Because they know they're reliable and they can depend on that kind of work. So, because from like a mechanics perspective, for those who are coming from that side, really what it's about in terms of portfolio is you have to have established designs, and you have to be pitching constantly to publishers. So that means you've come up with a concept, you've play tested it until you're so sick of the game you don't ever want to play it again, and then you play test it some more. And I can talk more about the play testing process in a little bit, but really when you take it to a publisher, it should be a final playable game with kind of crappy art. And the reason I say that is some of the publishers don't want to pay for art you've already paid for. They already have people they trust and rely on to do their art, and they'll pay for those people to do the style they want.
Okay.
But if your game is unplayable because the art is so bad, that's a problem too. So
Yeah.
it's really a fine balance. But I have definitely pitched games with terrible clip art and gotten them signed. So it really is about the mechanics and making sure you've tested your game enough. And then there's sort of this crazy person barrier that's unfortunate, but I think exists in the industry, where when you approach a publisher at a convention or at an event and say, I'm a game designer, and they haven't heard your name before, their first kind of reaction is, okay, but are you? You know, and they won't say that, but you kind of will get this sense of like,
Yeah,
okay,
but like untrustworthy front.
and that you've done your research, that you play games in the industry, that you're up to date on what the current stuff is, that you haven't spent 20 years working on a pet project that you absolutely refuse to change. That, I mean, like, I've been to pitching events where I saw a guy who was like, I invented my own RPG system, and he unfurled a scroll that went 10 feet across the floor and started talking about it, and the publisher just went like, yeah, no. Yeah, and part of it too is like, that publisher doesn't do RPGs.
Yeah.
So that's the other side of it too, is know who you're talking
Researching
to.
those publishers.
Yeah. If you want to do licensed stuff, you're going to narrow your scope very quickly. So, for example, if you develop the best ever Star Wars game, don't bring it to us because we can't do Star Wars because we don't have the license.
It'll just make us really sad.
Yeah, because we'll say, that's really cool, but
We'll get really sad.
we can't do it. But on the flip side, Fantasy Flight Games, who does have the license, does most of their development in-house, and so they're not looking to sign outside things. So you might have put a lot of effort into making a Star Wars game that can never be published as a Star Wars game. And so you have to kind of find ways to re-theme or keep your themes generic.
So don't like leave it so detailed, but leave it big enough so they can adjust to
Have
the idea.
detail in the right spots.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a balance, right? Like, if your theme is like a Wild West theme and the game mechanics tell that story super, super well, that's awesome, because then players will have that immersive experience. But if your theme is one particular license and it only works as that license, there's only going to be one publisher who can make that game, right? Because whoever has the rights is going to be the one who can do it.
Yeah.
And so you're going to narrow your scope to, do they want it or not? And if the answer is no, which it could be no for a variety of reasons, either that licensor won't sign off on it, or they just don't have room in their product line, or they don't want to pay royalty, whatever it may be, now you've got this great game that can't become a game. And
Right.
so sometimes when you're doing the independent thing, you want a game that has a flexible enough theme, or like it's just generic Wild West, so you can take it to 6 or 7 different publishers, hopefully get interest from like 2 or 3, and then sign with whoever gives you the best deal.
Okay. Thank you.
Other reasons why people aren't here that we can kind of riff off.
Well,
Well, go ahead.
well, I was just wondering what, like looking at the future, what's going on with the games and how, we were mentioning publishers, where might I look to do the research on, which publishers do what and things like that. Just the general information about the game industry.
Yeah, I mean, BoardGameGeek.com is always the best place to start, because it's an encyclopedia of literally every game ever, with lots of forums and information. You can go on there and search any game, and it's going to come up with full stats on how many players, how long it takes, reviews, photos of the game components. So like, if you were interested in doing something for a particular license, you could just go into BoardGameGeek and type Star Wars and see what games come up and who published them. Or if you're looking to do something that's just generic space themed, you could start clicking through and seeing who's doing space games. In terms of who I would pitch to, I would start with the hotness list on that website and see who has games sort of in the top 10, 20, 30 on the hotness list, because those are the publishers that clearly are hitting the mark in terms of what people want. And as an independent designer, like, if it were me, I would want to sign my game with somebody who's getting a lot of attention in the industry from that hotness list. So if they just put out one of the best games of the year, they're probably a good person to sign with, because they're making quality games, they have a good eye for it, and people are paying attention to what they're doing. So that would definitely be my recommendation.
And then if they say no, and they have feedback, listen to it.
Yeah, that goes back to kind of that are you a crazy person factor. If your response to a publisher's feedback is to argue with them, it often doesn't go well. And I've been on both sides of that table where I've been pitching games and they've given feedback, and sometimes I thought, that's terrible feedback, that would break this game. But you kind of have to say, oh, that's interesting, I have to try that, right? And when you're on the other side and someone's pitching you something, I've definitely seen people say, no, we can't do that. It's like, ooh, I'm telling you, for this particular license, you would have to. Like, if you're pitching a Harry Potter game and you're pitching something that we know, like,
That
will
they
never
will
be
not
signed,
approve, yeah.
like, there's potential that in your game Harry Potter can die. That's a non-starter, right? Like, there's no way we're gonna go to Warner Brothers and J.K. Rowling's team and say, okay, so sometimes Harry Potter dies, and they're gonna say,
No.
yeah, let's do that game. Like, it's just not gonna happen. So you have to be kind of open to that feedback from different publishers. Otherwise, they're gonna go, you're not gonna be easy to work with, and it's gonna be really tough, so we're not gonna do that. But having plan B and C of who to pitch to is really good. And I've actually had publishers say, I love this game, I can't ever publish it, but you know who can? And literally at Gen Con, right, like the big convention, I've been walked from one booth to another and introduced to people with the, hey, I love this game, we do like sci-fi horror, this game is about chickens. You know who should publish
All
this?
those patent chicken games.
I've designed several games with chickens, I don't know what it is.
It's the humor.
Yeah.
Who doesn't want to play chicken? I don't know.
Till the head gets cut off. Well, I guess I have some basic nuts and bolts questions. Maybe the first is, what do you find makes a game fun? What are the essential qualities?
Oof. So,
An audience should join in too.
yeah, so I mean, I'll kick off. So my perspective is kind of skewed because I'm a mechanics designer, right?
Right.
So when a game has a really cool mechanic, story is less important to me because I'm like, ooh, this is a cool puzzle thing I want to do.
Yeah.
But for most of the consumer base, I don't think that's true. I think people want to feel like they're doing the thing. So if our game is, you know, a space adventure, I want to feel like I'm having a space adventure and I'm shooting up other ships and feel immersed in that experience. If the game is a race, a player's turn shouldn't take 6 minutes, right? Because it no longer feels like a race, so you're sucking some of the fun out. I mean, there's just elements of gameplay that sometimes universally ruin an experience. Analysis paralysis is one of those. If I have too many choices on my turn, and I spend so much time doing the math for which of those is best, and everyone else is just sitting there watching me do the math, it's not going to go anywhere, right? So you want turns to be rather snappy so that like no one feels like they have too much downtime. You want an immersive story that you feel that experience. Honestly, like now you better have pretty solid art to compete in the market space. That means having somebody like Darren who's going to do amazing 3D stuff that people are just like eager to paint and collect and have, and really good board art and cards and all those things that people like want to own the thing, and then they feel really excited when they play it because that all helps them feel immersed in the experience.
Can the mechanics trump everything?
Sometimes, not every time.
Yeah. Terraforming Mars, anyone played it?
Oh, no.
The art kind of makes me cringe, but the game is really, really good. If they did a second edition with better artwork, yay. But yes, so it can happen.
Depends how obsessed with art you are.
Yeah.
Like if you can let it go, then I think mechanics can rule. But if you can't, like if you get stuck on it,
I mean, like Monopoly.
it
Like the
depends on
traditional.
Oh yeah, I don't like it.
Yeah.
I don't like any part of it, but
Mechanic wise, that's how people started off just playing the mechanics of it, and then
Yeah.
they started adding more and more like the Harry Potter and the
Yeah.
Game of Thrones, and then they started
So that
adding that
improves it.
aesthetic.
yeah.
So
Because it makes it more appealing visually. But if it's awful looking and not that great of a game, then you're like, I will
you
never
play it
this.
for about a month and you're done.
Not even.
Not even a month.
Played
Well,
once.
and you think about, right, in the hobby market space, like if you go into your favorite local game store, there are games literally everywhere in that store. And if your game doesn't have a good visual presence, like people flip around the back of the box and they're like, ooh, that looks boring, and it goes back on the shelf and they don't buy it. That can be a barrier to word spreading about your game, and it's like you might have the best mechanics ever, but if everybody looks at the box and goes, I don't think I want to invest my time in that. And I've definitely done that, and then heard reviews later of like, this is the best game ever, and I'm like, I guess I'll give it a second chance, but even then it's usually kind of low on my list compared to a game that has good reviews of the gameplay and really stellar art. Even in an abstract game now, you want sort of a good visual appeal, right? Like there might be no story to it, like chess really doesn't have much of a story, but it can look really pretty, right? And so would you rather have like the ornate chess set with stone pieces and a beautiful board, or the dollar store version that's like hollow plastic? It's the same game, but one of those feels a little better to play, like the weight of the pieces and the visual of the board, that kind of thing. So.
Are board games becoming increasingly popular, or what's kind of demographic, or maybe, I don't know, the trends in the board game industry, or how do you guys stay competitive?
Yeah, so there's kind of different like segments of the market, right? So you have the mass games, like you go into Walmart, Target, Toys R Us, like the games that are there, and then you have more of the specialty games, which you'll see in like a Barnes and Noble, and then the true hobby side, which you get online and in local game stores. That segment and the specialty segment are really growing. And I would even say, to an extent, some of the traditional mass games are starting to decrease as more and more people become familiar with games like Ticket to Ride and Settlers of Catan, and like as these games become more household games, people are like, oh, I'd rather play this than Chutes and Ladders or Monopoly or Clue. Like there are more and more appealing games coming out, and it's becoming increasingly competitive. I think there were several thousand games released at Gen Con this year, some ridiculous number, and that's one convention, you know, which had 65,000 people attend this year. So, yeah, it's a very much a growing market, and more of those hobby games are starting to trickle into mass. So if you go into Target, you can buy Settlers of Catan, you can buy Ticket to Ride, and they're more and more coming to companies like us and saying, can you do an exclusive game just for Target? Can you do an exclusive game just for Walmart? Because they're seeing that people want more from their board games, and they're looking to us to provide it.
Do you have to cater to a specific demographic, or is it pretty broad, or? I just see my 13-year-old playing video games, so I don't see her, you know what I mean? But I know she's open to it. She has played board games in the past, but I'm just saying, I didn't realize that there was such a big market for it, I guess, you know?
I think it depends on the type of game.
Yeah.
So like party games are probably older, like a very kind of like 20s to 30s, like more dialed in, but like then kids, you know, obviously kids games are kids games, but then like the popular hobby ones like Catan and whatnot are now like everyone can play them.
Yeah, and they've done junior versions of those games. So there's Catan Junior for playing with younger kids, because I think there's also a parent segment that's like, if I have to play Candyland one more time, but I can teach you Ticket to Ride Junior, which feels like a real game.
Sure, Boston.
Yeah. So
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So that's definitely there. But yeah, I mean, if we're doing My Little Pony something, that's a different audience than you know, if we're doing something for Marvel or something like that. And, then there are companies like Haba, right, which is a company in Germany, and all they do is kids games, but they do really good kids games. So, which I even like to play, even though it's like, oh, the target age range is like 4 to 10, and I'm like, whatever, it's fun.
Cool.
But I guess going on to the hobby shop demographics, it's probably like 15 to 30 male.
Okay. Oh,
I'd
okay.
say. I mean, it's a lot
Changing
of,
a little bit.
I don't know, like, what would you probably say?
I'd say it's changing.
The gender demographic is definitely shifting. It used to be much more heavily male, and now it's not anymore, which is really
It's
a
still
good thing.
women, but
Yeah. The age range, yes, to an extent. The more your game can appeal to more people, the better, right? Like, some of the games we do are gonna say 14 and up or 16 and up, depending on the content.
Because of or just because of the license.
Yeah.
So like, if we have, what do we have, a Fallout, like that's 17 and up, because the game is mature.
Gotcha.
But that's the only reason, like, the game itself isn't, like, and there's nothing in it that needs to be mature content. It's just the fact that it's based off of something that is,
Okay. Cool.
like the thing.
Yeah, I'm just thinking from like if I go to Artifacts or Game Empire, like that's a lot of people playing like Magic the Gathering and that kind of blend.
Yeah, for sure.
So going back to like the graphic design standpoint, would you guys be in charge of like the marketing or like content creation or collateral, or would that be more of the publisher?
Well, we are the publisher.
Okay. I just want to.
So we have a marketing team that does a lot of it, and
Because
then the designers of the game work on some of it too, because we're familiar with the assets and everything, and we're more familiar with the game, so we'll make quick play guides and things like that, since we can easily do it, since we're already immersed in the world of whatever we're working on.
And then like all the advertisements and all that too, that would go on your end as well, like per se a Facebook ad or a Twitter ad.
Yeah, that would be in-house,
Okay.
at least for us.
And you said you have about 50 employees?
Mhm.
A little over.
How big is your art team?
Well, how can we? I'll let you count.
Do you ever outsource for like
We do sometimes, so
tasks?
sometimes for illustration,
Okay.
we'll outsource,
Okay.
especially, we do a lot of games in a year,
Yeah.
and sometimes just workload.
Okay.
It makes sense that we'll outsource both mechanics design and art
Okay.
for different projects. Sometimes we, like any other publisher, will get pitched game design from an outside person if it fits either with a license we already have that we're like, ooh, we can take your thing and make it a Harry Potter thing. We'll sign games like that because it builds out our catalog and with
And sometimes they're
less
really
work,
good.
and sometimes they're awesome games, so why not?
Yeah.
And sometimes we do the opposite where we're like, ooh, we need to do this thing. It's for a license nobody in-house knows, but we know this outside person who's a game designer who loves that license, so we're gonna have them make this game for us, and we'll just kind of help massage it into the final product.
Okay.
But illustration stuff, I would say we outsource quite a bit of that. Like,
Yeah.
it's a weird thing for us because a lot of what we do is like we get an asset download from like our partner, like here's all the images you're allowed to use for this particular license because you have to keep true to those characters and the way they want them portrayed.
Yeah.
And they're very specific guidelines for very
Gotcha.
specific things. Some are more loose and some are not.
Yeah.
And we have, I think, 8 graphic designers and 3D artists
Okay.
in-house. And then we have 4 game designers.
Okay.
When is Gen Con?
It's always right at the end of July, early August. It's the first weekend in August this coming year.
Would you mind showing us how you do a pitch?
How I move.
A cold pitch.
I feel like I'm already rusty.
Do you want to pitch the thing?
Chicken game.
It's right there.
The best advice I was ever given on doing a pitch, I'm not so good with the role play, but I will give this advice, is if you're in an elevator with a publisher and you want to tell them about your game, you want to tell them, in the game, who are you, what are you doing, and why? So the who are you is, what character are you playing as, right? Like, are you a real estate baron? Are you a space adventurer? What are you doing? Are you trying to build up the best array of hotels and make a lot of money? Are you trying to blast the enemy to dust? And why are you doing that? And that's more like, how are you winning this game? Is it to exterminate your enemy completely? Is it to have the most money after a certain number of turns? Those kinds of things. And then your pitch should always include somewhere in it, how many players, how long does the game take, and what's the target age range, right?
This is like a 60-second elevator ride, or?
Yeah, and honestly,
That's what
like
you get?
most of your pitches, that's like what you're gonna get. Like, there's a lot of speed dating events at the conventions where you get like 6 minutes per publisher, and that includes showing them your game, like your introduction, any questions they may have, and then your 6 minutes are up and they move on. And you do that 20 times in a row. And it's sometimes great because you get the perfect publisher who loves what you do, And then the next publisher comes and it's Haba, and they're like, we make kids games. And you're like, well, let me tell you about this super gory adult game. Pass. And then you sit there for the longest 6 minutes ever. And you're like, cool. All right. What are you guys up to?
How's your gin gone?
Yeah.
Say that a lot.
Thank you. Thanks.
One of the things you can do too is if you haven't seen sell sheets before, you can jump online and just Google like sell sheets, or jump on like Board Game Geek or San Diego Board Game Designers Guild and ask people to see. Sell sheet is basically an 8.5 by 11 that is the back of your box, right? And so it's those stats: how many players, what's the age range, how long does the game take to play, what's in the box. Because if you pitch something that's like, my game has 600 custom dice. No one's making that game. Sorry. Like the cost on that is, and all 600 are different. So it's great, right? So publishers want to see that right off the bat as like, what's it going to cost to make the game, and then ideally a picture of your game set up on a table, and then some overview of like the story and what you're doing, like 2 paragraphs, and that would be your sell sheet. Because when you're at a convention or you're interacting with publishers, we're getting a lot of stuff thrown at us. And it might be like, oh, that was that cool space thing, but I don't remember anything about it other than it was a cool space thing. If I can pull out that 8.5 by 11 and be like, oh, here's the game, and here's the designer's contact info and all of that, that's a huge help.
So, like turning that elevator pitch into a resume page.
Yeah. Yeah, like we were just at PAX Unplugged, and I sat down with a designer who literally had a binder and like clear sheets in it with all of his designs, and he went through and he knew who he was pitching to and talked about each game and several licenses he thought would fit each game that he had designed that he knew we already had. And then a few of them he was like, I know you don't have this license, but if you could get it, this game would fit it perfectly. And so he had those ideas in mind, and then he took out of those sleeves all of those sell sheets because he had multiple copies, and gave me all of those to take back. And then he did the smart thing is he emailed me 2 days after I got back to the office and said, hey, just wanted to check in, and that kind of thing. So that would be an ideal scenario. But I think between his schedule and mine, we had about 15 minutes where we could actually talk through 5 different game designs he had. So you're not always going to get a lot of time, and there's going to be a lot of stuff going on around. So having those kinds of things that like
At the ready.
Yeah.
Question for you. So, are you 3D modeling? What programs do you use, or you?
I primarily work in ZBrush. I work in Maya also, occasionally for some hard surface stuff to block in. But other than that, I use NetFab to prep things for 3D printing, because all my models need to be 3D printable, because that's how what we usually send off to get tooled.
So how long? So what's your background before you came to?
Before I started working here, well, I graduated from here in September 2015. Before I came here, I was in the Marine Corps for 9 years. And before that, worked at a supermarket in Massachusetts. So making my way out here and discovered doing stuff for 3D printing here at the school. And but I only had one class of that, but it was enough to hook me, and I got into the 3D printing aspect of everything right when it was starting to become in demand. I was the first internal 3D modeler at the company. Before that, they were using primarily freelancers, and since then
Hand sculptors.
And hand sculpting, traditional, doing the little maquettes, so do a Monopoly piece literally at that size. Traditional sculpting.
That's
and
impressive.
that's what we used to do. Now we do. Now we don't really use many freelancers because I just
Save us a lot of money.
work.
Because we don't let Darren sleep.
No.
Here's
We both have a bed under his desk.
Yeah.
6 figures
Got my
next
little
week.
hammock, yeah, so I'm golden. It's good.
No big deal.
I was gonna ask too how you guys got into this company, and also, is there any software that you had to learn that you didn't know when you left the school here?
For me, I knew what I needed to know, which
Okay.
is InDesign, Photoshop, and Illustrator.
Okay.
You need to be strong in InDesign. especially as a production person, but also in graphic design, because most of what you're doing is you're laying it out in InDesign, and you use the other computer programs to create the assets. And it's much easier if you have it all organized. And then so my backstory is I have a degree in history, and so I decided I didn't want to teach, and that's kind of what you kind of got to do if that's what your degree is. So I moved down here and went to this school, and I just went for graphic design, got it done in I think a year and a half, just powered through, just got an associate's. And then after I kind of struggled a little bit looking for a job, and then I guess I had a good portfolio at the portfolio show, and a couple of temp agencies kept calling me, and then finally they called and they said, well, we have a job for you if you want it. And so I was like, oh, okay, and then
That was this one?
That was this one.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah. And I was like, all right, well, I have blue hair, do you care? And they're like, I don't think they will. So,
Awesome.
yeah.
Do you guys primarily just do only like physical board games, or you try to do like digital?
We don't do digital.
No?
No. We have a couple apps for timers and things like that. That's more sent out. We don't have anyone in-house that can do it, and it would require training. But mostly, not mostly, all physical.
Any more of your backstory of how you got into the company?
How did you get in?
Let's see here. I pretty much got in the company. My exit interview with my career advisor, I pretty much had to let her know how much work I put into every single project I worked at the school. I was a full-time student who fully focused on school the whole time, and that I deserved a really good job getting out of school. And then
You're joking, right?
Huh?
This is a joke.
No, this is definitely
He's lying.
not a joke. I spent 3 years getting about 4 hours of sleep a night just so I could get a job exiting out of school, to make sure I did, doing something that I loved. But that was a sacrifice I was willing to make to ensure that I got into the industry that I wanted to get into. It was purely passion. And I got a contact through my career advisor for this 3D modeler position at this company, USAopoly, and I did my research on the company, and I knew everything that they did, just didn't know necessarily it was them that did it. So, and then I just prepped myself for my interview and had the job 2 days after I graduated.
Awesome. Your portfolio, was it strictly class projects, or did you have your own?
No, I had taken a personal project of making my own chess set for 3D printing. Once I fell in love with, I had 2 classes, so only 2 weeks of instruction on 3D printing stuff, and that was enough to hook me.
Wow.
Fell in love with anatomy, and that's key for sculpting, period. So that's how it happened. Yeah.
Just say my story is a little different because I came from the mechanics design side. You asked the question about software. I use Excel more than any other program. Seems really boring.
Computer has Photoshop.
It does.
And then got scared and closed it.
Yeah, I use InDesign when Arlo makes me. Arlo's one of the other visual designers that I'm working with on a project right now. But most of what I'm doing is laying out like all of the rules for a whole deck of cards in an Excel spreadsheet. Like, it doesn't look very pretty, but then I'm giving that to a visual designer to say, make this look better than an Excel spreadsheet so someone will want to play it. And writing rules in Word and things like that, so it's not the most visually exciting aspect of the job. I got into this particular job because I was doing the work already, so I started designing games in 2011 just because I loved board games and had an idea one night and was like, oh, this is a game. And I spent a lot of time making it, and I sat down with some people and played it and realized this is a very broken game. Which
happens a lot.
Yeah, and I made the mistake a lot of people do, which is I got really excited about my first idea, and I put a lot of time into like visual design and like component quality, and then it was broken, and I had to throw most of that away to make it a playable game. I then learned to make your first game on like index cards and just things that you're super prepared to throw away, because it makes it that much easier when you realize it doesn't work the way you thought on the first try, to just throw it all away and make it again. There's a lot of recycling in board game design. But then I had been pitching games to publishers. I helped coordinate the Unpub event that happens about every 6 months here in San Diego for people to come play test the games they're working on. Through that, I started building a network in the area with publishers and other designers and things like that. I got a couple of my games signed with Gray Fox Games, which will be out sometime in 2018. And then USAopoly had reached out to me potentially to do a contract for one game as sort of an outsourced designer. So I came in and met with Andrew, who's one of our other designers, and our former creative director, and kind of said my piece about why I thought I should be able to do this one game. And they called me 2 days later and said, how would you like to just work here? And I said, yep. So I quit my super stressful job at the University of San Diego, where I was emergency on call for the residence halls, don't recommend, and switched over to making games.
Kind of already answered this, but as an independent designer, how did you find your group of playtesters, and how would you recommend forming them in terms of, like, do you want them all on the same game as it goes through different iterations, or do you want to like rotate out different styles of of players?
I mean, the more perspectives you can get, the better, but having some people who play consistent iterations is also good, because if you've ever played a game for the first time, it's hard to know like every nuance of that game in one playthrough. And so having people who played a couple times and can start to develop strategies for how to play the game, especially more complicated games, you want some return playtesters. The Unpub events and the San Diego Board Game Design Group are great opportunities to just go to Barrel Harbor at ease and sit down with other people who design games and who know games and say, here's a thing I made. And people like Pat Scott will break it real bad. And you will take your bruised little ego and you will go home, and then you will realize, I'm really glad he did that, because I'd rather he do it than the publisher I'm pitching to, right? And then you go home and you make the game better. I usually leave playtests like really excited, because now I know what I need to work on next, and it gives you that focus again. You have to be able to do that and like accept the criticism. Your best friends or your significant other or your parents are not your playtest group, because they will probably tell you everything you do is great.
Or it'll turn personal.
Yeah, or it'll turn personal. Like, everything you do is terrible, and you're like, thanks, Mom.
Yeah. I guess I'm sitting on the couch again.
So having some reliable people, like that's why I like the board game design group it's consistent people that give really good feedback that you know you can rely on. But at some point, like going to conventions or going to the Unpub events where you're going to get who you get, can give you really new perspective of like, ooh, now somebody who would never sit down and play this type of game is playing it because their significant other wanted to play it. And so here we go. But their perspective might show you something that like, oh, the hardcore gamers all got this rule, but to somebody who's not, it's super confusing. Maybe I can streamline that and make it better. Or this element of the graphic design is communicating something different from what I want it to. You also need to be thinking about, is your goal to pitch to a publisher or go to Kickstarter? There's different elements of those two things. If you don't want to quit your full-time job and go broke in the process, I wouldn't recommend Kickstarter. People often think like, oh, I'm going to make more money, right, because I get the full cut. After you make a lot of mistakes in production and distribution and things because you don't have that experience necessarily, most people who do Kickstarter games lose money or barely break even. Whereas with a publisher, at least you're guaranteed a royalty percentage and they handle all that for you, so there's no financial risk. And you think about the amount of marketing and coordination that goes into producing a game. If you've never done any of that before, like we have a whole team of 50 people to do that. Most companies have a team to do that. You are you. So if you take something to Kickstarter, you're doing the work of the whole team. You're doing the graphic design, the marketing, which means you're going to lots of conventions, you're getting lots of feedback, you're sending out reviewer copies, you're hiring an artist, you're paying for all that stuff. So, and then when you're bringing things to playtest, you're also having to test your art, your rule book, to make sure all that stuff works for people. So, yeah.
Actually, that was, oh, sorry.
Sorry. You had a question earlier, but you can continue.
My next question was largely about Kickstarter in terms of where it fit in the hobby market and stuff, because it's odd that it's largely pitching to a group of people a unpublished game based on a video and some images here and there, and then it just seems like a very odd market. A lot of game designers seem to use it as sort of a repeat pre-order business or something that.
Yeah, I mean, from lots of people are using it, right? Like publishers are using it, independent game designers are using it. I think for an independent game designer who wants to do their own thing and feels like they have the connections to manage that type of a process, it's a way to guarantee the money up front, so you don't go super broke doing like, I'm going to do a print run of X number of games and hope I can land them in stores so that a customer can find them. You know, at least you're going direct to consumer and you know people already want your thing. There's been some criticism of the smaller publishers who are like kickstarting every game. Like Tasty Minstrel Games is known for kickstarting basically everything they do. But the reality is, if they didn't do that, they would do 1, maybe 2 games a year, because that's how much cash on hand they would have to do the print run, get it into distribution, get it in stores, wait for that whole print run to sell so that they had the money to do the next one. Kickstarter allows them to accelerate that process and do more games per year because they have the money up front. Ultimately, if you do a campaign well and you have reviewer copies that have been played and there's feedback and there's buzz in the market space about a game and there's hype that's generated before the campaign, it can be a great way to generate a lot of revenue. If you don't do any of that thing and you think Kickstarter is a marketing tool and you'll just throw something up there and people will find it, chances are you won't hit a funding goal. So it's I think a very effective tool, and the hobby market has learned that that's a place to go to look for hot new stuff. But there's a lot of work that goes into managing a campaign, and I've heard people describe it as soul crushing for the 30 days that you're running your campaign, because the reality is you have to respond to everybody who comments on your page.
Or they freak out.
Yeah, people go to Kickstarter to feel included in your product, and if they feel like they're being ignored, they will pull their backing because they start to have concerns about, if you can't respond to my comment, can you deliver this product, right? And so you have to be fully invested. Jamie Stegmaier, who runs Stonemaier Games, wrote a book on crowdfunding, and a lot of it's on crowdfunding as a whole, but much of it is focused on doing it for the board game industry. If you are even half considering a Kickstarter, you should read the whole book cover to cover. And then from there, probably jump on his blog and a few of the other blogs, like James Matthews' blog on like game design and Kickstarter, to really get a feel for how much work it really is and what needs to go into it before you just kind of. I've heard people say like, "Oh, you just throw a thing on there and you make money." No, you don't. So.
What's the name of the book again?
It's crowdfunding something. Jamie.
Very official.
Yeah, Jamie Stegmaier is the author. It's like one of the first hits on Amazon. Yes. It's like 175-ish pages. It's a really pretty fast read, and the last chunk of it is like 150 one-liner tips. So if nothing else, scan that first and be like, no, I don't want to do any of this, or maybe I'm down for that.
For a game designer, I don't know who's next. I don't want to
You
step
can
over
go, just
someone.
go.
Okay. For a game designer to create a game, what is the most beneficial part about creating a game design to present to people to say, hey, this is what I'm making, help me finish it, kind of thing? Or kind of like a criticism or critiques that would help benefit you to finish that game. Like, what would be the beneficial part of it?
I'm not sure I follow.
Or like, okay, let me say it like this. If I was to create a game, and I can do a majority of everything. I can design the game document, I can give you the aesthetics, and I can give you the mechanics. If I was to present this to, say, a crowd first, what should I present to them without without overboarding them with information?
Wouldn't it just be a trailer? Get them into the mood of what the game's gonna be about?
Well, it depends on what your goal is, right? Like if you're trying to sell the game, it's very different than if you're trying to get people to play and give you feedback.
Okay.
If you're trying to sell it, that means you've already done a lot of the feedback part. And I recommend doing that before you do too much of the visual design, because if the game mechanics change, some of your art and visual design is going to be wasted time.
It can be drastic.
Like, usually my first version of a game is markers on paper, and I draw a thing, and this is a guy, and whatever. Like, you put them in a little base, and that later becomes a super cool 3D thing that Darren does. But before that, it's like a paper standee that you move around the board. If you go to playtesting events, you don't have to do much to get people to play your game, because that's why they're there. So you just kind of say, like, I have this thing, and why is it compelling to play? Like, what's interesting about it? Oddly, a lot of publishers that I've talked to hate the word unique. My game is unique. Well, they're the publisher. They'll know if it's unique or not. Because sometimes people are like, my game is totally unique, and they describe it, it's like, that's a game. You can buy that game. Someone made that game a long time ago.
There are 5 other games like it.
Yeah. And it's like a real estate game, and you move around the board and you build hotels.
So, run?
What you want to do, though, is highlight what's compelling about it. Is it your story? Like, what adventure am I about to go on? Now, for some of the Euro-style games, like, that's probably not where you want to start, because it's like, well, it's the Industrial Revolution, and, you know, or it's the 16th century, and you're a farmer. Okay. And if you don't feed your family, they die. Okay. Like, great. That sounds depressing. But that's a curriculum. But if you have like a really compelling mechanic, like, oh, this one uses 3D pieces and it's got a puzzle thing, like, highlight that, because people are like, ooh, I want to play with that thing and do whatever it is and manipulate those pieces. But if it's like, oh, you're going to go on this awesome adventure, like Galaxy Trucker is one of my favorites. Here's the game. You're going to build a spaceship out of garbage, and you're going to fly across the galaxy and like battle asteroids and other ships and all this stuff. And if any of that is left when you get to the other end, you can sell the parts for money. Okay, it never works out. Your ship falls apart a million times. It's hysterical. It's a lot of fun. And why is anyone building a ship out of like plumbing parts and garbage? I don't know. But that's the story of the game, and like that's enough of a pitch that people are like, tell me more, right? Like, I'll play that. Whereas other things, it's like, yeah, maybe not so much the story, the mechanic, like what makes you want to play the game, right? That's where you want to start. I don't know, other thoughts? Yeah.
I don't know, I, like he said, definitely when you want people to look at it, don't invest too much energy into like the style and everything of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like you want pieces, but they could be paper and things like that, because things do drastically change.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, so we've got a game here that we made in-house, Infection at Outpost 31. And like, we went through so many iterations and so many different things, and we kind of started off trying to make it look kind of nice. And then it devolved into sheets of paper.
Yeah.
That we cut up into roughly the same size to be the cards, because it got to the point where we were throwing so many things away, and things were broken. So
Yeah.
like drastically changed, so.
Yeah, I don't know if you probably remember this from gameplay and game design. You had it with Dylan, I'm pretty sure.
No.
No?
Any
Okay,
art
so.
and animation.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
So pretty much that we did the whole production line from creating the game idea to actually creating an actual board game, and going through iteration and iteration on top of that. I completely understand like the whole building up and then coming back down and then building up again to skyrocket out of the sky, but I think where some people still don't understand, and I like to help even students that I talk to get the point across, is that iteration that you go through. It's a lengthy process, and I'm trying to like dumb it down to like a few steps so they can get it across. Like, step 1, build your idea and flesh it out. Step 2, start off with a crappy version of your game, and then step 3, go through those play testings. But what would be like the most difficult like hump to get over when it comes to building a game design?
When it's broken and then you have to fix it.
Yeah, I think it
It's
depends.
like,
It
it's
depends
not
on the
working.
person, though. Like, I've seen people really struggle with just making their first version because they get this idea and they're real excited about it, but as soon as it hits the table, it's vulnerable to criticism. And I think getting people over that hurdle of like, make it as ugly and as fast as possible. Just get something on the table, and even if you have to play all 4 players by yourself to figure out where it's broken, do that right away.
Yeah.
And then do it again, and then do it again, and again, and again. I think for me the hardest part is when you get close, but not quite. And it's figuring out, after months of development, what do you throw away? Like, because the longer you work on it, the more attached you become to some of the mechanics. Like, well, I started with this idea, and the game evolved to this thing. And sometimes you realize that the whole thing you started with is the worst part of the game. And you have to be willing to just say, I can put that away and maybe use that in the future, but it doesn't have to exist in this game. Because the goal is, this game is meant to be the best game it can be, not for me to cling to this idea I had 6 months ago.
Right.
And I think people really struggle with that letting go.
Yeah, that's kind of like the hardest thing that I tell other students that I've worked with is like, love your work, but don't fall in love with your work. And I think that's kind of like the biggest thing that I kind of trying to like point across. And if there's like a different way of saying it, or if there is kind of like that intuitive way of showing students, like, hey, this is good for now, but let's put it aside and build it up better, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think if nothing else, it's asking the question about every element of the game, or just sort of, if I had to cut one thing, what would it be? Like, if I had to cut one rule component or one physical aspect of the game, say it was too expensive to produce and I had to get rid of something, or whatever, like, what's the weakest link in my game if I was forced to get rid of something, and then start from there.
Okay.
And a lot of that is the play testing. Like, you learn to watch your players, and when you see, like, this is a telltale sign. If people are playing your game and this happens, fix whatever was just happening. Like, because people are bored at that moment, either because somebody's taking too long or that element of the game is not exciting. That's like a telltale sign to just get rid of that thing.
Okay.
You could also say you want the game to be the best it can be, and if something's holding it back, then get rid of it.
Okay.
Because you want it to be the best it can be. It's not about this one specific thing in it, it's about the game as a whole. Or whatever it is, like whether it's graphic design or anything you're working on. You want the project as a whole to be successful, and you want it to be the best it can be. And if the way you deal out cards in the beginning, for whatever reason, is the problem, like, what does that matter if that changes, if the game is going to be better? So.
With these constant reiterations in a portfolio standpoint, would you want to see all those reiterations kind of like a creative process, if you will?
So what I did is I had the final, and I selected some specific things to show. So like that I put on my website for the projects. So my portfolio, I had the specific thing, and it all depends on where you're going. And then on the website I had the image, and then I had broken down kind of what I went through and descriptions of how I got to where I was going. Because it doesn't hurt to show it, you just don't want to bombard people with that. Because
with too much information, they're not going to pay attention.
Yeah. But I mean, if they're interested, you could say, hey, like, this is how I got here. Like, this is how I fleshed through this whole thing. And I think it's interesting to see as a person, like, if I'm working with someone, I want to know that they can problem solve and get through things.
Because within a year, I'll be doing a portfolio show for myself. And I'm working on a big nonprofit brand that I've been trying to create myself. And I feel like just creating a giant case study of what problems I had to face, that would probably be a good portfolio piece to show.
Yeah. I wouldn't make that your whole portfolio.
Yeah, have like other stuff to show as well.
Yeah. So like being honest with your failures and showing how you failed and how you overcame them is a big deal. Being humble about it, not trying to hide it. So like you do want to put your best foot forward, but you want to show that you did have problems and you know how to get past them.
That you're driven to get better during the project itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
From a mechanics perspective, no one wants to see 20 different versions of your spreadsheets that you deleted. But they do want to know that you
People covet
play
those.
tested with people that you didn't know, and that you've actually done something with that feedback. So being able to talk about that, because what that tells a publisher is if you have feedback, I can work with that, right? Like I will take that because I'm here to make the best game possible, not here to make my game the way I envisioned it and being stubborn about it. So it's more about showing you're somebody they can work with and being somewhat flexible on your design. So you never want to start a pitch with, I've been working on this game for 10 years. That's too long, and you're probably too close to it. But you also don't want to start with, I came up with this idea yesterday, and that means you haven't tested it and it's not ready. So it's a balance there.
So if I create like focus groups to gauge people on the brand itself, I would just talk about their feedback, what they would see more, and then what they would see less of.
Yeah,
And what you listened to from that and what you took from it, because not everyone's advice is always correct.
Yeah, you would
Very
probably
true.
take some research and back it up if it was actually legitimately true.
You need to be open to listening to what.
Be a team player.
And I've had moments with publishers too where they give me feedback. I'm like, actually, I got that feedback a while back. I tried it that way. Here's why it didn't work. And they're like, oh yeah, that makes total sense.
Okay.
So, I know you've been waiting like forever to ask a question, so I'm gonna.
I just had a question about the materials. Like if you, like the expenses of the materials. Like if you, should the game designer focus on the post-production, like what it takes to do the mass production material? Like if it's expensive to create, I don't know how to explain it, but
Yeah, I mean, having a general awareness of it is good in the sense that don't invest a ton of time in doing something that has like hundreds of custom dice, because those all have to have molds made, it's expensive to produce, it's heavy to ship, like in a general sense, but don't shortchange your game design based on a hypothetical it might be too expensive. I think already our production team is
Ready to murder us?
is wary of my design, because I'm like, okay, it's got 60 miniatures, it's got boards, it's got cards, it's got custom art, and they're like, slow your roll. But it depends on what you're designing, right? Like if you're designing like a Blood Rage style game, for those that know Blood Rage, you've got a ton of miniatures, you've got cards, you've got boards, you've got great artwork, but that's an $80 MSRP game. If that's what you're going for, you're going to design your componentry around that. If you're trying to make a mass game that's going to be in Target for $25, don't put all that stuff in it, right? Because you can't get the production costs down that low to make that a reality. So you kind of have to know what your audience is. Are you going for a strictly expensive hobby game that's more of a collector piece because of the art and componentry, or are you going for more of a mass-produced like type of game that you would hope to see in a wider array of stores and for a lower price point? But ultimately, if you're an independent designer and you're pitching to publishers, they'll tell you where the line is, and that line might be, how would you feel about using standees, like cardboard cutout guys in a base rather than a 3D model? Or how would you feel about, could you take your 50 custom dice and make it 40 custom dice? And they'll give you that feedback of what you would need to do to adjust your design to get in the price point they want. But if making the best game possible requires certain components, I wouldn't start with the idea that maybe this is too expensive. Like I would let the publisher tell you when it's too expensive. But you can also look at games in the market, right? Like, what's in an $80 game box? What's in a $50 game box? And that'll give you some perspective too on, man, if my target price point's $50, well, what comes in a $50 game? It's a lot more than 2 decks of cards, right? So things like wooden cubes, generic pieces, you buy those in bulk. They're already made. Custom 3D components require tooling to be made. You have to have a different tool for each color of plastic you're using, because they have to like inject the plastic into the mold all at once. So if you have 6 figures and they're 6 different colors, you have to have 6 different molds. If you have 6 figures that are all the same color, you can make one giant mold that does all 6. So there's different things like that that add to your costing. So.
Yeah, that was my
Well,
question for you.
and what we say at work, at least at our side, is build the game you want, but have plan Bs. Is things will get torn away from you and your heart will break a little bit, but it doesn't mean it's bad. It means build what you want and prepare for the best, or build what you want and then prepare for the worst.
Yeah.
So always have backup plans and don't set your heart on things always. Like, if you want beautiful 3D figures from this guy, and they tell you can't, you're gonna have to let it go. It's a little soul crushing, but it happens.
Limited edition team version.
Yeah.
I think one of the pieces of feedback during Comic-Con that was mentioned was have the cost targeted with the playtime. Where if it's a shorter game, that people expect it to be cheaper, and if it's a longer game, people are okay with it being more expensive. And with that in mind, you can sort of target what's in the box.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's.
I would say within reason. So like if you're like, I could produce this game and make it $300 retail.
Yeah, well.
I will make it a 9-hour game. Nobody wants that game, right? Like, very few games can exceed the 2-hour mark and be marketable.
But not like 5 days.
Not if you follow the rules. Sorry.
But the reality is,
that's when I would yell at people.
Yeah.
Should only be 40 minutes.
In the hobby market, 45 to 60 minutes has become a sweet spot lately, that publishers are like, oh, you can have this great experience in an hour or less? Great. As soon as you start creeping up to 90, they're like, okay, convince me that it's a 90-minute game. Beyond that, they really want convincing, because if people can have a similarly good experience in 60 minutes, the perception is it'll sell better than that same experience taking 2 hours. And oftentimes you'll notice like, ooh, this game does last 2 hours, but at about the hour and 15-minute mark, people started checking out because it's like, and another round of the same thing, and you're like, here we go again, you roll the dice, I do the thing, like, it can get repetitive, so you have to think about how do you tailor that down. But with that said, yeah, you're not likely to sell somebody on a $80 game that plays in 15 minutes. Like, that doesn't quite sync up with like, by the time you set up all the miniatures and the components, the game was over. Yeah. Hooray. So.
Oh, one for the 3D.
Yes.
Like, I want to make my own pieces. What's a good 3D printer to get? What should I start with? Should I go to Costco, get that $300?
I started with the San Diego Public Library because they will print for free for you. You just have to sit there.
No, there's so much per ounce.
Oh, really? There is now?
Yeah.
It used to be free.
I saw that.
It's good to know now.
All the libraries, they charge a little bit for their.
Like, costs a lot to do.
Yeah, the materials.
The materials are most of your cost. Honestly, that's what I did when I was a student. I went down to the library. They used to print for free downtown. Then once I got my job here, we use 3500 HD Max printer, which is it's a big boy.
Yeah.
It's a big boy, wax coated. So it builds everything up inside of the wax, so you don't have to worry about building posts to support posts and all that stuff that you need to break off, because it just sits inside of a wax, inside of a wax core.
Yeah, I can't get one of those. Yeah.
I mean, but you could probably use any. I mean, there's some out for like $300.
Yeah.
Something like that. And anything helps that'll get you started. I know the San Diego makers. Some guys will teach you how to make your own 3D printer and stuff like that. There's all sorts of different little how-to videos on how to do that kind of stuff. If you don't want to spend hundreds of dollars on a good personal printer.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Also, be wary of filament. Filament is very tricky because of the size differences.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you guys, look and see your games in the stores, you get kind of this like little rush or.
Candy store every time I see it.
I geeked out. I went home to Sacramento and we had our thing game. It was like the staff pick for the store, and I was like, I'm gonna take a picture. So I was that nerdy person going, oh, taking it. Yeah, it's the sign that says staff pick of just the front of the box. It's like, I did this. I did a thing, literally
I
a
made
thing.
some stuff.
Yeah.
Were there any games that you regretted making or publishing? but there's been some stuff I regret designing it.
There are things I didn't enjoy working on.
Yeah, I mean, I have
Corporate games or not.
games that never got signed that I put too much time into, but they didn't get signed because they were terrible. But no, like corporate monopolies, I'm sure not.
No, they're awful.
For example, like
Soulless.
if Mercedes-Benz wants a monopoly for their Christmas party to give out to employees, we do that work for Hasbro. So it's not the most fun from a graphic design standpoint. Like put
Seal
this
coatings.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
But you can't buy those retail. Like you wouldn't find those in stores. They're just for those.
That would be what I'd be mortified to see on a shelf.
Yeah.
And thankfully our names are not on it, but it would be like, oh, no. But almost, there's nothing really. There's
we're-
things that I wish did better.
Oh, like sold
Oh
better?
no, there was so many games. Sorry.
Yeah.
There was
Yeah.
one game I did
There
not
was that.
like. It's called the selfie game.
Oh,
It was
geez.
bad.
I'm a photographer.
That one.
I'm a photographer, and with a double curse that we always say, if you're a photographer, your selfie game is bad. So meaning, if you try to take a picture of yourself, it's terrible. But you take a picture of anybody else, it's like
It's
professional.
better behind the camera. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's probably the only one that I hated working on. But I was also the production person, so I had to cut 600 cards for every time we sent it out. And we didn't have a chop cutter at the time, so it was hand done. So I found a way to tape them all, like a stack of them together with like painter's tape, so that it wouldn't rip the paper, and then cut them all in like large batches. And
Yeah. I feel
by the way, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, so after someone else had to do that, they got a chop cutter. Because I didn't say anything, I know. It's great now that I don't have to do it.
Push the buttons.
Yeah.
Chops it all down the line.
You want to make it a
We
lot
had
better.
that. They're making little flyers.
Benefit of working at a
Horror stories.
publisher, you get all the toys. The big 3D printers.
Yeah,
top
now
cutter.
you do. Sorry. Didn't have them that long ago.
Sorry.
You're fine.
Do publishers have sort of a expendable R&D process? I'm sure as an independent designer, you could work for like a lot of time on a design and then end up throwing it out completely and start working on something else. Is there more security in doing that with a publisher?
Like when you work for a publisher full time?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, typically we're assigned projects, so it's,
Okay.
like we do some brain labs things where we're able to pitch new ideas, but because we do a lot of license stuff, like we get assigned projects. So it's, you know, if we're working with WB and we're doing Harry Potter stuff, like we'll kind of come up with some things to pitch to them, we'll pitch it, and then it's like, okay, you're making this thing that's been at least preliminarily approved by the licensor.
Yeah.
So in our case, like most of what we're working on is a fairly safe bet. Occasionally projects get dropped for a variety of reasons, but it's not the same as when I was independent. It's like, I spent 2 years on this thing, and you pitch it to 10 publishers, and they're all like, that thing's dumb. And you're like, yay. You know, so there's less guarantee unless you've been contracted by a publisher that has asked you to do a thing. But usually you have to have proven yourself before that happens.
Right.
So there will be times where you invest a fair amount of energy in a thing and it just isn't going anywhere. And sometimes you'll realize it on your own. Like there are games on my shelf at home that was like, I worked on this, I was really excited about it, then it didn't quite get where I needed it to go, and I got pissed off at it, and I put it on the shelf. And there's a couple of those, like when I go to conventions, people still come up to me and like, I played that thing 3 years ago, when's it coming out? And I'm like, it's not, it's collecting dust on a shelf. And they're like, oh, I liked it. I'm like, well, you're the one, you know. So it's part of the process, but sometimes it's being willing to take a step back and realize like, no matter who I show this to, it's not going anywhere, and maybe it's because the theme is wrong, maybe it's something is not compelling about the mechanics, maybe there's 10 games on the market already that feel just like it, and figuring out, can you fix it, or do you put it away and do something else that you're more passionate about, or that gives you more life than trying to strong arm the other design.
Yeah, I know we
You ever-
definitely have the like, ability to drop things if they need to be dropped, but usually it's like, if something's really not working, we can scrap what we're doing and try something else. So like it's not the worst thing if you're wasting your time, because you have a little bit of security being in like our job to be able to do that, and we have the ability to create the like quick mocks to do that with, instead of spending, you know, hours of your personal time trying to make it happen. You can spend, you know, maybe 30 minutes making a quick mock. Playtest doesn't work, you can get rid of it, so it speeds it up pretty quick.
Do you have specific tools for your quick mocks, or is it just?
Yeah, we have a big HP printer that we have double-sided, or not double-sided, sticky paper in it. That's like a big sticker.
Like 42 inches wide.
42. So you can just print art and just stick it on a board and cut it. So we have a cutting table. We have a bunch of X-Acto plates, a bunch of rulers, the chalk cutter,
3D printer.
a 3D printer.
Yeah. So we can make game boxes that look like real game boxes, and we have a shrink wrapper. So if you're like bringing it to a pitch meeting or a convention, like, here's a game that's going to be a game in a year. It's like, but the box looks done already. It's like, yeah,
No.
that's just fake. There's nothing in there. You can pick it up and shake it.
We just made that in 10 minutes.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, we definitely have a lot of toys that we can use to make nice things.
Do you ever take a design that just didn't work and then was pitched to, or asked to license something completely different? You said, oh, these mechanics work out
Oh, like
pretty well, or yeah.
like mechanics that we thought were going to be one thing and then apply it to another. Yeah, I mean that happens. Sometimes we take mechanics that worked for one thing and became a thing, and we're like, that also works for this thing. Let's do another one of those, but for this license, right? So, like recently we worked with Czech Games Editions, and we got the Codenames license from them. So they licensed us the mechanics because it's like, hey, Codenames works for a lot of things. So Disney Codenames, Marvel Codenames, same mechanics, two different themes. So we'll do things like that, or sometimes a project doesn't quite go how you intended, and you just kind of put those rules in your back pocket, and then something else comes up, and you're like, oh,
What just happened?
yeah. I think the game Andrew did that's coming out in March, like that was a fantasy game that is now not a fantasy game, but was built off of those mechanics and evolved from something else. So it happens.
I'm curious about your game design process now versus when you first started to design games, and if you could like go back in time and give yourself advice for when you're first learning, what you would say, like, oh, learn spreadsheets earlier or whatever.
My undergrad is in engineering, so the spreadsheets were not a problem for me. The drawing, not my strong suit. Like, oh, let me coloring book pages. All right, there we go. That's a game. So I would probably have invested a little more time in learning the visual side of it. When I was designing independently, most of my ideas started as mechanics, and then themes were applied later. Now that I'm in this role, it's pretty much entirely the opposite, where we're given a license that's a story, right? Like, design a game based on this show. Well, the show has fans and a story and characters and plot points. I have to now make mechanics that fit that, so it's very much the opposite, but I find the games can be much more compelling that way. And I wished I'd done a better job of that with some of my earlier games. It's like, oh, mechanically, like, the rules of this game are interesting, but the story's kind of slapped on there because my brain functions first in mechanics and then story second. And I think games are much more exciting to play if people feel that story element. So being able to do both a little better, I think would have served me better in terms of adjusting to this role and being able to do that work.
Where do you see the board game industry going? I mean, having been in it for a few years now and watching kind of the trajectory of, you know, kind of the rise of all the Kickstarter games, and then all of Kickstarter kind of becoming a little bit more form and, you know, and the stakes getting higher there. And then turning into publishers are now becoming more of a thing. I mean, USAopoly is now, you guys are pivoting from doing the monopolies and all the branded monopolies and now changing over to doing a lot of these hobbyist games. And hobbyist games are here to stay. And you were talking earlier about how you saw 1,000 or 2,000 releases at Gen Con last year. Now it sounds like it's getting saturated. Where do you see everything going?
Yeah, the saturation's my kind of fear. Like, there's got to be a point, right, where the more games that come out, the harder it is for a new game to be the hot game of the year and to stand out, right? Like, and so that's why I said earlier, I think like if you don't have really compelling art to draw people in, combined with really good mechanics, it's a tough marketplace to fit into because everyone wants to release at those big conventions, everyone is going to the same reviewers for feedback. Some of those reviewers are playing everything and your game has to stand out among a crowd. But I think the positive aspect is the more I go into Target and Walmart and stores like that and see games like Settlers of Catan and Ticket to Ride and see more of the hobby games taking shelf space from some of the older games that are just classics that everyone plays but maybe aren't the best games out there, the more I see people introduced to our hobby because they sort of play these gateway games. Like, you know, so many times I tell people what I do and they're like, oh, have you ever heard of Catan? And I'm like, yes. And they're like, are there other games like that? And I'm like, oh, friend. We're about to go down the rabbit hole.
Here's my list of 200 games in an Excel sheet.
Yeah. I do own my whole house is just game shower. I have them
He shared
all
it with us.
in a list.
Holy crap.
But I think what's going to happen more and more is some of the games that aren't as strong and some of the smaller publishers I think are going to struggle a little bit. But when you look at like Asmodee North America, who bought everybody in the last couple of years, they bought Fantasy Flight Games, they bought Days of Wonder, they bought Z-Man Games, who had bought Plaid Hat Games. So like you're seeing some of these hobby publishers conglomerate and other publishers just sort of saying like, I wonder when they're going to buy us and we'll get our payday. Like at some point like the market can't sustain 400 publishers. Like it just becomes overwhelming. So I think some of that will happen. And then you see like Days of Wonder does one big game a year. That's what they do. They put all their energy into one great game, they put out that great game, but they're part of that Asmodee group, so they can survive on that because Fantasy Flight's doing a bunch of stuff and collectible games and things like that. So, but I think for the smaller publishers, they're going to have to continue to churn out hits in order to stand out among the crowd. And for the indie game designers going to Kickstarter and things, like there's, I think, a little less room for error because you're competing against so many other people. So if you're not willing to go all in and put in that energy to market your game and do the production quality and deliver on those promises, like chances are you'll get overlooked or won't last long in the space. And I think that's happened even to some of the really successful Kickstarter games. Is like, I made a thing, I sold a lot of that thing, I don't have any of that thing left, and it's not in distribution or stores anywhere, and I don't have a second thing, and that's the end of that company, right? And they did their thing, they were happy with it, and they moved on. So I think you'll see some of that too, where it's like sort of a flash in the pan. You had a game, people liked it, and it's never available again. So I don't know, but I mean, in general, I think the market is growing, and I think more and more people are being introduced or reintroduced to board games. And I think that's only good for all of us as convention numbers grow. PAX Unplugged was the first ever that they did a board game convention. It had like between 30 and 40,000 people for the first one. Like, those numbers are no joke, that like people are coming out to play games. So it's just a matter of like, when do we hit that saturation point and what does that look like in terms of, I don't think there's going to be a decline necessarily. I think it'll just be a plateau of competition where there's only so much the market can sustain.
And what does that look like? If everyone's conglomerating, like what predictions are you willing to make here publicly, you know, about the future of the board gaming industry? I mean, and artistically, financially, whatever, you know.
Yeah, I don't think we've seen an end to the buyouts. You know, just in listening to some of the podcasts and talking to other publishers, there's often buzz out there. Like, you know, I've talked to other publishers locally who've said they've had multiple offers for buyout, none of which were all that appealing, and then they've had offers from smaller companies asking to be bought out. So I think there's more and more interest in that, and saying like, I can't continue to do this alone, but I've got a hit game or two. Will you take on my brand and do all the management stuff that I don't like doing because I got into this to make games? So I think we'll continue to see small companies who have hits will fold into larger companies just for sustainability purposes. You know, you want somebody who has the cash flow to continue to print your game and who has the connections to get it into more stores and distribution.
Who won't go under if you make a mistake with a game that's not a hit or anything like that.
Yeah.
So you have a little bit of leeway. That's what I would think.
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, you think about it. If you invest everything you have in one game and it doesn't sell, that's why I said like companies like Tasty Minstrel are going to Kickstarter, because you know at the time they started doing that, they didn't have the cash flow to sustain a bad game. Like they were using all of the proceeds from one game to print the next game. So if the last game didn't hit and they didn't make any money, there was no next game, which meant there was no future of the company. But Kickstarter has become a positive trend for that reason, because it's like we know going in that this game is going to be a hit because we've already sold it and we've already got that money to produce this game and to start the next one. So I think without Kickstarter, we would have seen a lot more rapid decline and a lot less indie games coming out.
That includes like having good brand recognition. So say the first game was a hit, then you're trying to get a Kickstarter. Just having that brand name being associated with that, would that help with sales?
Oh, it totally does. Like Simon, right, is a game company. When they put up a Kickstarter, it funds in like an hour tops, because
Simon.
It's what they do. Like people know they make great games with fantastic art and amazing miniatures, and they basically took the best designer they ever worked with and said, how about you head our whole design? And they hired him full time. So people go, Eric Lang, Simon, here's my money. Like they don't even look at what the game is. They're just like, give me the thing.
So it's more of that brand identity that's really strong that'll help them create sales.
It's both brand and I would say to an extent designer. Like they're like the same way people will rush out and buy the new Stephen King book because they love Stephen King. People will rush out and buy the new Uwe Rosenberg game because they like his games. And so it's like, oh, what did he put out now? I'll take it. And it's like, do you even know what the game is? Nope, but he made it, so I want it. And, yeah, and in the hobby space, that's very much a thing that people follow publishers, they follow designers. Some people even, like, they'll buy a game just because, like, ooh, I like Josh Capel's art, so I'm going to buy his games. Like,
so the industry would probably want someone who is really recognizable. Of course, it's like they're the celebrity of that type of niche.
Yeah, in terms of like the full-time jobs, and a lot of companies, those are going to go to known people, but known people doesn't necessarily mean you've got a ton of games already out and are a name, but it could be you're involved in the community. Like that's how I got this job. You won't find tons of games with my name on them. In fact, you won't find any until next year. But because I was involved in the community and had already signed games that were in production and had been present in pitching games and showing the quality of my work, I was able to get a job that way. So.
Andy's fairly nice.
Only until you hire me, then I'm a jerk.
So the main thing is just be known for what you're doing and be known that it's more than just a thing that you do, it's like a passion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you gonna, the board games versus the video games, kind of, are the video games like really cutting into the board games? You seeing like a connection where you'll have a board game and then there'll be like something on the web or the market like for the game, and it kind of feeds in, they feed into one another, or they're more like versus opposites?
I think to a large extent it's an audience thing of like, I play tons of board games, I will occasionally play a video game. Some people in our office are very into both. Some people only play video games, and the thought of sitting down with other human beings around a table does not appeal. Sometimes we do board games based on video game licenses, and we get that crossover audience. So certainly the video game industry is a much larger industry in terms of overall revenue per year.
Costs a lot more to make.
Yeah, the investment for making a video game is extensive in terms of the number of hours and programming and testing, and we can produce something a lot faster and for less money that can create a similar experience in terms of having some competition and unique storyline and things like that. So I think we have a distinct advantage there that, I don't know, Pat, you do video game stuff. How long did it take you to do your...
My last one took 3 years.
Yeah, if we took 3 years on a game, we'd be in trouble.
Big trouble.
We give Darren about 3 minutes to do all the 3D sculpting, so.
And the whole time we're sitting there going, where is it? Where is it?
Make it better.
Wood, but I'm working on this other thing.
Do 9 chess sets right now. Show them how you do it. No.
Dolphins the candle.
How would you say for like tabletop simulator on Steam? Like how has that gotten visibility on some titles?
Yeah, I mean, I know some publishers really use it. So for those that don't know, Tabletop Simulator is like a virtual environment where you can play board games. So you go in there, you don't have to own the game, but you and your friends can log in and it's all there and you play all these different titles. I think for a lot of people who are maybe a little shy about dropping $50, $60 on a game, it gives them a chance to go in and try it and be like, ooh, I need this thing. Like I want the physical experience. I want to be able to put this on the table in front of my friends. I know a lot of people use it for like, hey, I had this great gaming group, and then I moved to California, and you moved to New Jersey, and we still want to play games, so it's an opportunity to do that. Some of the bigger companies are doing more app versions of their games, so like I mentioned Asmodee North America earlier, they've invested a lot in being able to do app versions, so you can get it on your iPad and play the same game experience with none of the setup, and I think that's translating to physical sales for them, that people are saying, oh, that's really fun, but it'd be more fun to play with people and not just by myself, like on the bus. So I think those are all good things. I think some companies have toyed with like app integration, so you have the app right when you're playing the game, and it's a sort of a unified experience. But I know some of the more hardcore gamers are very against that because their perspective is, I can have this board game and it never becomes obsolete. Like I can always take that off the shelf and set it up and it works. But if I need an app to play it, in 10 years, is that app still going to work on whatever device I'm carrying? And the answer is nobody knows. Or are you still supporting that app? So that kind of thing can happen where it's like, well, nobody supported updates for the new operating system, so the app doesn't work anymore, which means the game doesn't work anymore. Whereas, you know, my copy of Catan is never going to break unless I spill something on it. So it's a different kind of thing.
I've heard Monopoly mentioned quite a bit in this meeting, and I was just curious, is that the best-selling board game of all time?
Longest running, maybe.
Yeah, I think just based on time on the shelf, yes, it's probably sold more copies than any other game. For a little bit of history, so our company is USAopoly, and we started as
Making monopolies, right? Yeah.
Making like Bostonopoly and La Jollaopoly and things like that. That expanded obviously to
working with Hasbro to
and
make other licensed versions of
so
monopolies and things.
we would be like the intermediary. Like Hasbro gives us the mechanics for Clue, Monopoly, Yahtzee, and Cartoon Network gives us Bob's Burgers, and put those together and we do Bob's Burgers Monopoly, right? So that was like where the company began, and then we started doing our own signature games, original games, and things like that, and it evolved from there. But
we still do all the licensed games too,
and they still sell very well. So no longer our biggest seller though, the monopolies, right? Like collectively, I don't think they outsell Illustration.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
You make Monopoly. You made that first. So, and you didn't need the license first.
So the story is what our owner wanted to create. Was it La Jollaopoly for like his friends and family, and then somehow half got in trouble with Hasbro, but then it turned into them wanting to work with him.
Oh.
Yeah, because Hasbro had the rights to Monopoly when they bought
Parker Brothers.
Parker Brothers, right? At the end of Coronado and Bradley.
And so more.
So it was sort of one of those like, you can't make monopolies, you're not us. And they said, but we make good ones. And they said, actually, you can make those monopolies for us or with us. And so, you know, as much as we license like TV show and movie images, sometimes we also license game mechanics. So Clue, Monopoly, Yahtzee, Codename, Risk
right there.
so we'll work with the companies that made those games originally. They'll allow us to use the rule set and the brand, and then we can bring to the contracts we already have for different shows and merge those things together. So we'll take the Risk mechanics and we'll take Game of Thrones and we'll modify Risk to fit the story of Game of Thrones and produce that game. And we pay a little royalty to each side and then keep the difference.
Cool.
Did Monopoly have anything to do with the naming of the company, USAopoly?
Yeah. Yeah, so it started as Cityopoly and then it expanded to USAopoly. and will likely change to something new in the near future.
That's not what
As our product line expands and we do more original and hobby games, I think we're looking to move in that direction and convey that to our consumer base, who sometimes goes, "Oh, USAopoly, you make monopolies." It's like, we make other things too.
Yeah. Darren's wearing a Project Raygun shirt, which is our more hobby side. So it's still USAopoly, but it's not Monopoly, because we're like, the thing game we've made is not a Monopoly. It's not tied to Hasbro at all, and we don't really want it tied to Hasbro, because we want to stand on our own in that aspect. So that's what Project Raygun is.
The thing was a movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
We've made a game based off of the movie.
Are there any trends, this is a question for each of you, that you guys are excited about coming up in the industry right now? I mean, aesthetically, techniques in the work you do, or mechanically, I mean, stuff like legacy games, or, I don't know, any art styles, any stuff like that.
Popularity of miniatures games.
Yeah?
Oh, yeah, for you specifically.
Talk about that, talk about that.
Popularity of miniatures games is just getting more and more in demand, and keeps me busy. I like being busy. It's fun.
We don't want to see him not busy.
No.
Scary.
Yeah.
I'd say probably the art, or the fact that things are going a little more retro. So like things I loved as a kid are becoming games. And I'm guilty of buying something just because it's a license I like. And then playing it and going, well, it's not the best game, but it's the license I like, so I'm happy. But
I buy too many games, so the more games on the market, the better for me, the worse for my wallet. But
and your friendships? No, I'm just kidding.
No, I bring them to work, and that's the only reason people talk to me. But trends I'm excited about. I don't know. I'm excited to constantly have new games in the market, and some of that being like competitive edge to push me to do better work. But also seeing other people push some of those boundaries and give me new ideas of like, oh, you created a new thing, like when Donald Likes Marino basically created deck building with Dominion. That opened the floodgates for like, oh, here's a new way to make and play a game, right? And so always looking for that next thing of, Legacy, when that first happened, it's like, oh, we can do games that play out a story over a certain number of plays. I think it's that kind of innovation that gets me excited. And I think the community is also part of it. Is the more time I've spent in the industry, the more you realize that it's a pretty small community with a bunch of people in it. But like, publishers all know each other, most of the designers know each other. Like, when you go to conventions, people know who those people are. The reviewers are very approachable people. Like, it's a community built on playing games physically around a table, and so it's rare that you find people who are not approachable. And when you do, they're usually not people who are in the industry, but they're fans who just don't know how to be around people. But you don't make it in this industry if you're not about building community and being part of a community, because it's really hard to play board games by yourself. Like, yes, there are games you can play solo, but there's a lot more to the industry than that. So I think it's that aspect that like people are welcoming in a way that sometimes I think the video game industry is criticized for not being. When you play certain online games, the banter, we'll call it, is not super friendly to new players. Whereas in the board game industry, it's like people are more like pushers. They're like, hey, come to my house, play these games, play them with me, buy more games, let's all have all the games. And it's like trying to bring people into the fold, which I like to see that grow.
Does anyone have any questions from this side?
So for the students here, what, I know you kind of vaguely answered this question, but what's kind of the broad range of job opportunities within your company, like for the artists? And are there maybe very entry level or even freelance opportunities, like, sometimes they'll be like inker or cleanup artists or things like that? Like, what's kind of a broad range of jobs?
I'd say like there's just basic graphic designers that work on the games themselves. Production is how I got into it. So like I'm a fine graphic designer, but I got into it because they needed a production artist, which is just cleaning up everyone's files. So being really good at cleaning, being organized, and that's in files, not in real life, because I'm terribly messy in real life. Then there's marketing, so marketing's graphic designers, and that's different than game design. So 3D sculpting.
3D sculpting, 3D modeling, IT, 3D print technician.
Okay.
IT and 3D print are combined right now. Let's see here.
Well, for artist people.
Oh, well, for artists. That's about it, right?
We use illustrators as freelance.
Okay.
Usually we had one in-house. And then we do colorize things in-house too, so if that's a skill like you have, as well as being a good graphic designer, like we look for that.
Okay.
Because that'll save us from having to go out of house.
Colorized by, that's a different term than.
So like we'll have someone, I don't know how to describe it. So say we'll have a freelancer draw us things we need, but they don't have time, or we can't, or it just doesn't work out where they colorize it, so they fill in,
Oh,
so they do like the art,
So they
and then
like the
we
stroke.
have someone who does the like
fill.
backfill, yeah.
Okay.
That's what I meant. I'm not the one who does that, so I don't know what the official terms are.
And they'd probably want to use like Illustrator rather than Photoshop.
It depends on what it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about for design?
Like for the mechanics design?
Sure, yeah.
In terms of jobs, so it's everyone's going to start freelance. Like, and to jump into a job like mine as quickly as I did, and I say that after 6 years of designing games, isn't super common. And the reason I say that is most publishers are not big enough to have an in-house design team. And those that are, like we mentioned Simon earlier, like when they were looking to hire an in-house designer to lead their design team, they said, whose games make us $1.5 million on Kickstarter? Eric Lang's. Hey, Eric Lang, why don't you be our head of design? So it's not often a job you can just walk in off the street and say, I like games. So the networking is huge for that.
Not so much for the graphic design.
Yeah. You really have to be known with the people that you're pitching games to and getting involved, and some of that is just going to conventions and knowing who to talk to. Like, look up some of the publishers online and see what their actual faces look like, so when you're at a convention you can just stop and go, hey, you're this person and I'm this person, and let's talk about, you know, what's going on. Sometimes like just having a couple games done and pitched is a way to show you can do the work. More often than not, what you'll see from small publishers is they want developers, not designers. So the difference being, like, a game designer is going to create a game from the ground up. A game developer is going to hurt that person's feelings. I don't know any better way to put it. So like we have a game developer on our team. He's part of our design team, but his role is to break everything we make and point out everything that's wrong with it. And if you are a publisher, you need someone like that on your team who can identify, like, this is why this game isn't perfectly done, or where the fun suck is on it, or whatever it is. Because what they're doing is they're taking in tons of submissions. They need somebody who can quickly evaluate which of those shows promise and how to fix them. So having that skill is really important. And one of the ways to develop that is to go to some of these playtesting events, not with a game, but to sit down and play other people's games and give them really insightful feedback, and to practice that skill, because that ability to nuance and refine a game is really important.
Who writes your manuals?
Mostly the designers. So like, I design a game, I write the rules, then we all read it and figure out why it's bad. And we just got a copywriter on our team, so
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, that was a nice add, because that's sort of like Okay, sigh of relief. I have somebody I can give it to who knows grammar rules.
Or there was one game I was working on where I guess I developed it. It was based off another game, and then I constantly just felt like I was making things up. And then they was like, okay, well, you write the rules, and I was like, all right, like, here I go, like. But like being able to like describe it to the copywriter now and having them translate it in a way that makes sense, where it makes sense in my head, but it's not necessarily going to make sense in what I write. Yeah. My brain works.
Before you have that copywriter, were there any tips or guidelines that you could give yourself when you came to writing that stuff? Because when I have to like write bios or like context in my case studies, I kind of have a hard time explaining it.
At least personally for me, I get it out. I write what I'm going to say out, whether it's grammatically correct or not, or it's like free form, and then I go back and write it again. And then I go and chop it apart, and then put it back together.
So a lot of revisions.
Yeah.
Okay.
And for rules writing, like being familiar with a lot of rule books and knowing which ones you really like and which ones you're like, man, I read this 6 times, I still don't know how to play the game, versus the one that you're like, oh, this followed in a logical order. Set up the board, do this thing, then do that, and this is how a turn plays. Like, that's what you want to emulate, is the ones that are easy to understand. There's a great video on YouTube. It's Mike Selinker, who runs Lone Shark Games, but he was behind Pathfinder and a bunch of other stuff. And it's 10 rules for rules writing. And it's just this like short video presentation he did at a convention about like things you should never do when writing rules. And he gives real published examples of things people did to break those rules and how awful they really are in terms of like learning the game. So like one of them is the game board uses hex spaces, right? So hexagons. And the rule book says like the board is comprised of hexagons, which will from this point forward be referred to as squares. Why? Ouch. You know, but the concept is call a thing what it is, like, and call it that thing every time in the rules. So like,
be consistent.
When you write like a paper for English class, they're like, don't use the same words over and over again. It gets repetitive. When you write rules, use the same term every single time for a thing. Like if it's a certain kind of card, you always have to call it that same thing. My other favorite one from that is the Don't Be a DeWizard, which is a D&D reference. One of their manuals, right before they published it, they decided instead of mages, let's change it to wizard. And so somebody did a find all replace to change the word mage to wizard. So every time it talked about dealing damage in battle, it then said DeWizard. And we were like, deal 6 DeWizard to the rumor has it the guy who did that was fired, but yeah, don't be that person.
Proofread everything.
Yes.
I imagine
Have other
quality
people
control.
control
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, a problem there.
There's stuff like that in software. They made changes. They took this one, was like for a defense industry. And they said, oh, we can take this and make it into a game. So they have kangaroos with guns because nobody proofed all the coding and the code together.
Part of it too is you can play test a rulebook, and we'll do that late in the process of, you know, I mean, standard playtest, right? You're going to teach people how to play your game so they can get started faster and you can get the feedback you want. Sometimes you'll start them in the middle of the game because you're like, this is the part I'm not sure about, and I'm just going to stage like we played the first 20 minutes to get right to the point of what I want to fix. But eventually you'll do a blind playtest, and the best thing you can do is give the game to somebody who's not you, who can genuinely take it to a group of people and say, here's the game with the rules, have at it. And they can observe for you, so you want it to be somebody you trust, but that also means people can say, this game is garbage, and not worry about hurting your feelings because you're not in a room. Whereas if they say, can I buy this right now, they're not doing it to inflate somebody's ego, they're doing it because they genuinely want the game. But when you're testing rules, sometimes you'll see like, the way you read it is to do this one thing, and everyone else reads it totally different, and they're playing the game differently because of it. And so you have to be aware of that.
Any last thoughts? We're just about out of time here.
How complex can you make the rules?
What's your audience?
Oh, that's true, right?
Yeah.
You see Warhammer 40K.
Yeah.
what aspect of board games drew you to the hobby, and what aspects got you on the publishing side? That's way too broad a question, but I'm sure.
Wow. I mean, I've been playing games for as long as I can remember. Hero Quest was definitely a big one for me as a kid, like playing an adventure story all the way through. But I would say I got reintroduced to the hobby through Catan and a bunch of Euro games from there, and then just had an idea one night that like I had to put on paper. Like I just had to make it, see if it would work, and haven't really looked back since. So.
For me, like growing up, I had a sister who's 12 years older, and my parents are older, so they didn't really want to play games with me, because I was that annoying little kid. So I played a lot of things kind of by myself, like Life, and I'd pretend to be the different people. So it was a little depressing. It's not a happy story. So like I played games with some friends, but like I wasn't a big gamer. Until I started working here. So like I knew the games and I played them and I would play with friends, and I had friends who liked the party games and like the word games, which I'm not the best at because I'm more of a art person. And so once I started working at USAopoly, I got introduced to people who played these kind of games and were patient with me when I was learning. And then after that, it was just like, I'm buying all the things. And we get together often and play games. So I'm not going back to playing Life by myself.
Now you're actually playing Life.
I am actually playing Life. And I'm being successful. We made up different personalities.
Rather than having a bunch of marriages. And,
Yeah.
Children.
My embarrassing life story. Just kidding. Yes, you.
I started off playing mainly like D&D, paper games, strategy games like Risk or Catan, or I can't remember the name of the space one. But anyway.
The space one. You narrowed it down.
I know.
Yeah,
right?
it narrows it down a lot.
The space one kind of like Catan.
Eclipse.
No.
Twilight Imperium.
That would be it. Twilight Imperium.
That's like Catan to you?
He's warped.
More, yeah.
And harder. And space.
But it's been probably about 12 years since I played that one.
I know what we're doing next week.
Oh.
Sweet. All right. But yeah, any game with little miniatures and strategy, I'm pretty much sold on those ones. Played a lot of 40K. That gets real expensive really fast. Yeah.
Well, thanks again for coming out and giving the talk. I hope that it was useful for everyone here.
Thank you.
There's plenty of pizza, water.
Yeah.
Please.
If anybody wants to take a pizza home,
Please take it home.
please do. Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming out. That was really good info, very insightful. And is it okay if these guys connect with you on LinkedIn and those kinds of things?
Yeah.
Cool.
I don't
Awesome.
usually check it, but you can.